Brookhaven, Texas, a quiet town where nothing ever happens until it does. A place where neighbors leave their doors unlocked, where families gather on porches in the warm evening air, where the most excitement comes from high school football games on Friday nights. But on the morning of July 17, 2021, that sense of peace was violently shattered. A 911 call came in just before sunrise. The caller's voice was frantic, barely coherent, and screaming about gunfire, about a woman begging for her life, about something terrible happening next door. By the time officers arrived at 18 Willow Creek Drive, the damage had already been done. Inside, the house was a scene of pure carnage, the kind of violence that doesn't just happen. It's deliberate, personal, and fueled by something dark. Blood pooled on the hardwood floors, splattered against the walls. The television flickered in the living room, casting a cold glow over the chaos. A family of 4 had been slaughtered in their own home. The mother, Julia Briggs, lay in the hallway, face down and her body twisted unnaturally. A single gunshot wound to the chest. Not an execution, a struggle, a desperate fight for survival that she lost. Her teenage son, Liam, barely 17, was slumped on the couch, his phone still in his hand, the screen cracked beneath a pool of blood. The position of his body suggested he had been alive long enough to see what was happening, to understand what was coming before the fatal shot ended it. But the worst was down the hall. The youngest, Emily Briggs, only 7 years old, was found in her bed, small hands clutching her blanket as if she had tried to make herself disappear. 2 shots, one to the chest and one to the head. Someone wanted to be sure. And then there was the father, Daniel Briggs. But he wasn't lying among the dead. He was missing. His car still in the driveway, his service weapon gone, no signs of forced entry, nothing taken except for his absence. To the first officers on scene, it didn't make sense. A robbery gone wrong? A targeted hit? A missing father? A victim or a witness? The questions piled up as detectives arrived, their faces grim as they took in the brutality of what had happened. Neighbors stood behind the yellow crime scene tape, whispering, watching and terrified. The Briggs family wasn't just any family. Daniel Briggs was one of them, a trusted officer in the Brookhaven Police Department, a man known for putting criminals behind bars, a man respected for his dedication to the job. And now, his entire world had been wiped out in a matter of minutes. But something was off. The way Julia's body was found, like she had been dragged. The way the shots were fired, not in panic, but with precision. The way Liam's phone, shattered and bloodstained, still had one unsent message on the screen, a message that would be the first crack in the perfect illusion of this crime. The hunt for Daniel Briggs had begun. But what no one knew yet, what no one could even begin to suspect, was that the answers to this case wouldn't just expose a killer. They would reveal something far worse, something buried deep within Brookhaven's own police force, and by the time the truth came out, it would already be too late. Brookhaven police officers were no strangers to crime. Domestic disturbances, bar fights, the occasional armed robbery, this was the extent of their usual workload. Brutal home invasions, entire families wiped out in cold blood. That didn't happen here. But now, it had. And one of their own was at the center of it. The crime scene at 18 Willow Creek Drive was still active. Detectives and forensic teams moved carefully through the house, collecting every piece of evidence, every potential clue. But something felt off, even for the most seasoned officers. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no jimmied locks. Whoever did this was let in. And then there was the father, Daniel Briggs, a veteran officer, a man who knew how to protect his family. but he was nowhere to be found. Was he taken, or had he vanished on his own? Detectives needed answers, and they needed them fast. By mid-morning, officers began canvassing the neighborhood. The 911 call had come from a house across the street, from a woman named Ellen Waverly. She had lived next door to the Briggs family for over a decade. She knew them, trusted them, and at 5:42 a.m., she had woken to the sound of screaming. Her account was terrifying. "I heard Julia. She was yelling, pleading. Then the gunshots. So many gunshots, I don't know how many. And then it just stopped." Ellen described seeing a figure through her bedroom window, moving quickly through the backyard. Not running, not panicked, just moving. By the time police arrived, the entire street was awake, standing in their doorways, watching in disbelief. But no one had seen Daniel Briggs leave. No car pulling out of the driveway, no shadow slipping into the woods. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. The missing officer theory took on a new layer of unease. If Daniel was kidnapped, why wasn't there a ransom demand? If he was a target, why was his entire family executed? And if he was alive, where was he? Inside the house, detectives were finding more questions than answers. The positioning of the bodies told a story of terror. Julia had fought. There were signs of a struggle in the hallway, broken picture frames, scratch marks on the hardwood. She had run, maybe to save her daughter, and she had been chased and murdered. Liam's death was just as haunting, maybe the quickest. He had been shot while sitting on the couch, his phone in his lap. The screen was still on. And then there was Emily, the smallest victim, found still tucked under her blanket, as if she had never even woken up from her unknowingly last slumber before she was killed. There are monsters in this world, monsters that even the devil wouldn't want in hell. To kill an entire family, even a sweet little girl. This was personal, deliberate, calculated, and ruthless. The level of violence suggested rage, not the kind you see in a robbery gone wrong. Not the kind from a panicked intruder. This was different. This was execution. And then, officers found something that changed everything. In the living room, Liam's phone was still clutched in his hand. The screen was cracked, smeared with blood. But when investigators looked closer, they noticed something chilling. An unsent text message. "Dad, where are you? There's someone..." That was it. No name, no details. Just a broken message. Detectives froze. Why would Liam be texting his father for help if his father was in the house? It was the first major crack in the investigation. Detectives retrieved phone records from the Briggs family within hours. The results were shocking. Daniel Briggs's phone had made one outgoing call at 5:11 a.m., 30 minutes before the murders were reported. The call had lasted only 6 seconds, and it had gone to a burner phone. As officers continued their search for Daniel Briggs, a new discovery sent the case spiraling further into chaos. 7 miles away in an abandoned field, a car was found burned beyond recognition. The VIN number was melted away, but the license plate registered to Daniel Briggs. The discovery turned the case on its head. What did this mean? Had Daniel tried to escape his killers only to be caught and burned alive? Had he been taken? Or had he done this himself? At 2:30 p.m., the FBI officially joined the investigation, and for the first time, they entertained a new, chilling possibility. Daniel Briggs might not be a victim. He might be something else entirely. Within hours, forensic accountants uncovered something disturbing. Daniel Briggs had a second bank account. It wasn't tied to his payroll. It wasn't listed under his wife's name. It was offshore, hidden. And in the last 6 months, over $280,000 had been deposited. The money was coming from shell corporations, businesses that didn't exist, and in Brookhaven there was only one group that used shell corporations to move money: organized crime. Daniel Briggs wasn't just a decorated cop, he had secrets, and those secrets were starting to come to the surface. Investigators turned to traffic cameras near the Briggs house. If Daniel had been taken, there had to be some sign of movement. And then they found it. At 5:23 a.m., 19 minutes before Ellen Waverly made the 911 call, a black SUV had been captured pulling away from the house. It was Daniel's car. But the driver? The windows were tinted. The figure inside was barely visible. But there was one thing that stood out. The person behind the wheel was wearing a police jacket. By nightfall, the news broke. Officer Daniel Briggs, missing since the morning of the murders, was now the prime suspect in the execution of his own family. The town of Brookhaven was stunned. This was their officer, their protector, and now he was a fugitive. But why? Had he snapped? Had he been working with criminals? What was he running from? And the most terrifying question of all, if Daniel Briggs was capable of killing his own family, what else was he willing to do? Brookhaven was no longer just a quiet Texas town. It had become the center of a nationwide manhunt. By nightfall on July 17, 2021, the FBI had issued an official warrant for the arrest of Daniel Briggs. No longer a missing person, no longer a potential victim, now a fugitive. His wife and children were dead, his home was a crime scene, his car found burned beyond recognition, and the only person who could answer for any of it had vanished. The case had taken a sharp, horrifying turn. What began as an execution-style murder was now something even darker. Had Daniel Briggs planned this? Had he been forced into it? Had someone framed him? Or was this a man who had spent years hiding his true nature until it finally exploded? Within hours, the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, was activated. Local law enforcement worked alongside federal agents, tracing every possible lead. They weren't just looking for Daniel Briggs, they were hunting him. And the search began with his last known movements. The phone call no one expected. Investigators retraced every moment leading up to the murders. Daniel's phone records had already revealed something unusual. A 6-second call made at 5:11 a.m. to an unregistered burner phone. But when the FBI tracked the location of that burner phone, they didn't find some shadowy criminal or cartel enforcer. They found Detective Aaron Hayes, a longtime friend of Daniel's, his former partner on the force, a man who had been radio silent since the investigation began. When authorities arrived at Hayes' apartment, they found it empty, his car gone, his phone turned off. But there was one crucial detail. Hayes had cleared out his bank account that morning, $32,000 in cash. And just like that, Daniel Briggs wasn't running alone. To understand Daniel Briggs, investigators had to go back before the murders, before the missing money, before his sudden disappearance. They had to look at who he really was. Briggs had spent 15 years on the force, a model officer, a family man, respected, trusted. But when the FBI pulled his internal records, the image began to crack. In 2018, Briggs had been part of an undercover narcotics task force investigating cartel activity along the Texas-Mexico border. The case had fallen apart. Officially, the operation had been shut down due to lack of evidence, but the real reason had never been made public. A large sum of cash, over $200,000, had gone missing from an evidence locker. No arrests were made. No suspects named. The only two people with access to that evidence room? Daniel Briggs and Aaron Hayes. The two men had been cleared internally. No proof, no case. But now? That missing money was starting to look like the first domino in something much bigger. For over 24 hours, there was no sign of Daniel Briggs. Then, at 7:42 p.m. on July 18, a gas station security camera in Baker County, Texas, nearly 160 miles from Brookhaven, captured a black pickup truck pulling into a remote rest stop. The truck belonged to Detective Aaron Hayes, and the man in the passenger seat, Daniel Briggs. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking him. He looked calm, focused, in control, not like a man on the run, not like a man consumed by grief, like a man who had a plan. Briggs and Hayes were seen exiting the truck together, speaking quietly. A few minutes later, Daniel walked away, alone. Hayes returned to the truck, drove off, and hasn't been seen since. As for Briggs, he walked into the woods and disappeared. Or so the police thought at that time. There was no car, no supplies, nothing but the dark, open land stretching for miles. It didn't make sense. Where was he going? Why split up? And most importantly, who was helping him? At 3:18 a.m., a state trooper in Laredo, Texas, pulled onto a desolate stretch of Interstate 35. He was responding to an abandoned vehicle report. A black SUV, doors open, engine still running. And in the dirt beside it, a body, face down, hands still gripping the ground. One bullet to the back of the head, execution style. It was Detective Aaron Hayes. The man who had helped Daniel escape, the man who had been his closest ally, now discarded, eliminated. How did Briggs kill Hayes if they had split up? Investigators began reconstructing the timeline. After parting ways at the gas station, Hayes had driven south, alone, or so it seemed. But surveillance footage from a different gas station, 30 miles away, showed something alarming. A dark figure matching Briggs's height and build had been seen climbing into the back of Hayes's truck shortly after the two men split up. The figure hid under a tarp, a setup, a trap. Briggs had never walked into the woods. He had waited, followed, and when the time was right, he struck. Detectives now understood the pattern. Briggs wasn't running in fear. He was erasing evidence. Aaron Hayes had been the only loose end, the only person who knew the full story, and in Daniel Briggs's world, that meant he had to die. Investigators pulled more financial records. They weren't just looking for Briggs's movements now. They were looking for where he had been before the murders. And they found something chilling. 1 month before his family was killed, $150,000 was wired from Briggs's offshore account to a name that sent a shockwave through the investigation. Mark Holloway, a former cartel enforcer, a man with a history of making people disappear. And just like that, everything changed. What if Daniel Briggs hadn't pulled the trigger? What if he had paid someone else to do it? But if that was true, why? By now it was clear Daniel Briggs wasn't just a cop who had gone bad. He had been playing both sides for years. But something had gone wrong. The money had stopped flowing, the cartel had grown impatient, and suddenly Daniel Briggs had a choice: fix the problem or pay the price. By the morning of July 19, 2021, the manhunt for Daniel Briggs had reached critical mass. He was no longer a missing person, no longer a cop on the run. He was a killer, a fugitive, a man with nothing left to lose. And he was still out there. And law enforcement knew one thing for sure: if they didn't stop him soon, more bodies would follow. For investigators, the key to catching Briggs was following the money. By now they knew he had been laundering cartel cash for years. using his badge as a shield while moving millions through a network of offshore accounts and fake businesses. The problem? Briggs had been smart, careful, deliberate. Every trace of his transactions had been wiped clean, buried beneath layers of shell corporations and false identities. But there was one weak link. The accountant no one expected. Among the names tied to Briggs's financial web, one stood out. Stephanie Cole, a forensic accountant based in Austin. She had no known ties to criminal activity, no connection to the cartel, but her name appeared in multiple transactions linked to Briggs's offshore accounts. And when the FBI arrived at her office, they found her desk empty, her laptop gone, her apartment vacant, cleaned out. It was as if she had vanished overnight. But then they got a break. Her car had been found abandoned at a highway rest stop, her purse still inside, and when they pulled the rest stop's surveillance footage, what they saw sent a shockwave through the task force. Stephanie hadn't disappeared on her own. She had been taken. And the man forcing her into the passenger seat, Daniel Briggs. Law enforcement moved fast. Within 40 minutes, state police had set up roadblocks in every direction. Briggs was trapped. A police helicopter spotted his car heading into a remote stretch of woodland near the Guadalupe River. The FBI's hostage rescue team was deployed. This wasn't just about catching Briggs anymore. It was about saving Stephanie Cole's life. As agents closed in, they found the car abandoned on a dirt path. A trail of footprints led toward the riverbank. And then, a gunshot. Teams rushed forward. They found Stephanie on her knees, hands bound, tears streaming down her face. Briggs stood behind her, gun pressed to the back of her head. 1 second later, he pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. A misfire. The malfunction gave agents the opening they needed. They shouted orders, weapons drawn, but Briggs was already moving. Before they could react, he tackled Stephanie into the river, using her as a human shield. The water was shallow but fast-moving. Briggs forced her under, struggling to keep her submerged. HRT agents raced downstream, repositioning. And then, with brutal precision, Briggs let go of Stephanie, shoving her toward the officers, and disappeared beneath the current. The river was dense with vegetation, a labyrinth of reeds, branches, and mud. By the time agents reached the other side, Briggs was gone. For 2 more days, Daniel Briggs remained a ghost. Then the FBI got a tip. A warehouse on the outskirts of Houston. A meeting was happening there. Cartel members, high-level figures, and the informant had overheard a name, Daniel Briggs. The pieces snapped into place. Briggs wasn't fleeing. He was going back to the people he had betrayed. He wasn't just trying to disappear. He was trying to buy his way back in. But what he didn't know was that the FBI was already waiting for him. By 2:30 a.m., the warehouse stood in eerie silence. A rusting skeleton of steel and concrete on the outskirts of Houston. It was a place where deals were made in whispers and lives ended without ceremony. Tonight, it would become the site of Daniel Briggs's final play. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with oil and dust, the only illumination coming from flickering overhead bulbs. The meeting had been arranged days before. Briggs had reached out using old contacts, promising something the cartel couldn't ignore. Surrounded by cartel enforcers, he was outnumbered, unarmed, and alone. But he was a man who had spent years navigating dangerous deals, balancing loyalty and betrayal. He wasn't here to beg, he was here to make them believe he was still valuable. He had come with an offer. One last, desperate attempt to buy his way back in. Information, assets, leverage. He claimed to have everything they needed, but the cartel had not forgotten what he had done. He had stolen from them, deceived them, used his badge to cut his own deals. His sins were not forgiven, The tension in the room was suffocating. There was no way to know exactly what was said in those final moments, but the outcome had been inevitable. Briggs had been marked long before he walked through those doors. Suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. A silent command given, weapons raised. The meeting was over, but Briggs had not come here to die without a fight. 2:45 a.m., just outside the warehouse. The FBI had been tracking Briggs relentlessly, anticipating his next move. The warehouse had been identified earlier that evening through cartel surveillance and intercepted messages. A SWAT team had been deployed, surrounding the building, prepared for an immediate breach. As agents positioned themselves, their intel suggested at least 7 armed cartel members inside, but no one knew how the meeting had progressed, or if Briggs was already dead. Then gunfire erupted. Inside the warehouse, chaos exploded in an instant. Briggs had made his move. The first shots rang out, sending bullets tearing through rusted steel and shattered glass. Cartel enforcers scrambled for cover, returning fire, but Briggs was already moving. Years of training had not been forgotten. A gun had been within reach. One of the enforcers, caught off guard, never had the chance to react before Briggs disarmed him. The tables had turned. A firefight ignited in the dimly lit space. The sharp retort of gunfire echoed off the walls as Briggs fought to escape. One gunman went down. Another staggered back, clutching his stomach. The air filled with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the acrid stench of spent ammunition. Briggs had no illusions about the outcome. This was not a battle he could win. His only chance was to get out before the FBI entered the fray. But by then, it was too late. Outside, law enforcement had been waiting for the right moment. The sound of sustained gunfire inside was their signal. The main doors were breached in an instant. Flashbangs detonated, white-hot light and concussive force momentarily blinding everyone inside. Agents stormed in, weapons drawn, scanning for targets. The scene was chaos. Cartel members returned fire, knowing their only chance at survival was to fight their way out. The standoff turned into a full-scale shootout. The air filled with screaming and rapid gunfire, a deadly cacophony of destruction. A SWAT officer was hit, stumbling back before being pulled to safety. Another cartel member collapsed, a bullet tearing through his throat. Briggs moved through the fray, dodging between combatants. He had been in situations like this before, on the other side of the law, when he was the one storming buildings, leading raids, bringing fugitives to justice. Now, he was the fugitive. He knew how they would move, knew where they would block exits. His only way out was through the loading docks at the back of the warehouse. Briggs sprinted toward the exit, the sound of gunfire fading behind him. He had one chance, one final escape. But as he reached the door, the warehouse lights flashed, illuminating the space beyond. FBI agents were already waiting. There was no time to think, no time to surrender. Briggs raised his weapon, and in that moment, they fired. 7 shots were fired. 6 hit the target, 4 to the chest, 2 to the throat. Briggs staggered, the force of the bullets slamming him backward. He gasped, blood spilling from his mouth and throat, the shock setting in before his body hit the cold, hard concrete. By the time the smoke cleared, Daniel Briggs was dead. The warehouse was secured, the bodies of cartel members were removed, the FBI had stopped Briggs, but there was no sense of victory. Instead, there was regret. Briggs had taken everything with him. The truth, the real motive behind his crimes, the answers that could have explained why a once respected officer had become a murderer. He had been a family man, a cop who once upheld the law, and yet in the end he had become the very thing he once fought against. His wife and children were gone, his closest friend executed, his alliances shattered. And the question that haunted every investigator, every officer who had once worked alongside him, remained unanswered. Why? Why kill them? Why not run alone without needless bloodshed? Why not turn himself in? Why not save his family, his wife, his son, and his little girl, all gone? These were some of the many unsatisfied questions that were left unanswered. The case had been closed, but the mystery of Daniel Briggs would never be solved. Brookhaven, Texas, would never forget. His name, once spoken with respect, was now a warning. The house on Willow Creek Drive remained a dark stain on the town's history, and the FBI, despite all their resources, would always carry the weight of one final chilling regret. They hadn't stopped a killer in time. They had stopped a ghost after the damage was already done. And in the end, the truth had died with him.